On bang, we're live streaming. It is Friday morning. This is our usual time, usual place at the Bridges of Meaning Discord server. If you are seeing this on YouTube live right now, YouTube streaming, I'm not looking at the YouTube comments. I know this is different from how YouTube usually works, but I'm not even looking at the comments. So go ahead and have your comments together. Rick is reading them actually, but I'm not looking at them, and Rick will just keep dropping a link into that to encourage you to come over to the Bridges of Meaning Discord server. And part of the reason I do the question and answer in this way is because I like having some back and forth with the people and not just reading a question and responding to it. And so if you want to engage in the conversation, come on over to the server. You can always drop your question into the text section, questions for PVK. Folks have been figuring out the system and keep putting questions in. And so I'm actually going to start with the backlog. And even if you put a question in today, we might not get to your question. Maybe I should try to be more succinct. I don't know. But we usually intersperse it with questions from the voice chat or follow-ups from the voice chat. So that's what we've been doing for a while. We have also this thing we call randomizing randos that we do from time to time, which is sort of a panel discussion about things. And the last one we did, that was excellent. I learned so much where we're talking about Pentecostalism and miracles and orthodoxy and symbolism. That was really a terrific conversation. So I'm looking forward to doing more of those. We do those sometimes, and we do this sometimes. And this is sort of an easy thing to do, which is just don't need a lot of setup. It's sort of easy to do. So thanks for joining us. If you're watching on YouTube, again, Rick put in a link to the Discord server, and you can join us there, and you might get a chance if you have a question, an audible question you'd like to ask. There'll probably be a time in the next 2 hours to do this. We usually take about 2 hours to do this, and here we go. So Dark Rider 9876, and I'm all the way back on November 2020. Rick, usually you got to scroll back, Rick. Rick sort of tries to, I see now he's poor Rick. He's only one guy, and some of you don't even believe he exists. All right, Dark Rider 9876 asks, any advice for walking the fine line between getting sucked into bullshit and being open to other ideas? Thinking fast and slow. Time is your friend. This is part of the reason that we should be a little bit more gentle and merciful with people who give bad answers, because minds change, ideas change. To be human means to get sucked into bullshit. And I'm using bullshit in the Vervaekean way. To be human means to be fooled, to have a bad idea, to try something and get it wrong. And so we should continue to work through our thinking, listen to people. I mean, it's all the same advice about becoming a good human being. Be gentle, be patient, be humble, be open, but don't be flying in the wind. Be resolute. Figure out what are some things that you're going to keep and what are some things that you're going to be flexible on, and keep that list of things that you're really committed to, of a reasonable size, and be open to others. Understand that you and other people are not the same thing. Have good boundaries, and I think those types of things are really helpful for navigating in the world. But now understand what kind of a world we live in. None of this will necessarily save your life. or keep you from getting COVID or a heart attack or die at the hands of an idiot or a car accident. This world is, by its definition, unstable, hostile, dangerous, and difficult. It's also beautiful and glorious and fascinating. So I think watch some people that you think are doing this well and learn from them. So that's a good question. And the answer, I don't think the answer is necessarily something that you sort of write down as much as picking up on the patterns of wise people and emulating them. All right. Night Ani Cringe Walker with a lightsaber there. Any thoughts on the thinking behind God calling the Jews to plant gardens in Babylon, the city of gardens? Oh, I never thought of that. That's a really cool idea. I think there's something to that. And I think it's sort of obvious. That's really cool. My thought is that's really cool thought. And I'm going to have to think about that a lot more. Some rage hard. Hi, Paul. If you've not already covered this, and even if I have, because things bear a lot of repeating often, how do you see the application of Ian McGilchrist's theory in the modern church? I believe his theories are desperately important and are a revelation when I read his book, but I have difficulty communicating his ideas to fellow Christians. It's a good question. I won't say that I'm a McGilchrist expert by any means. My understanding of his theory, for those who don't know it, the title of his book is The Master and His Emissary, that this form of intuitive, fuzzy thinking is what one hemisphere of the brain is devoted to, and the other hemisphere, this is roughly speaking, the other hemisphere is for taking that and digesting it into rules and systems and logic, if you will. And I think that's a tremendously good insight, because if you think about what is required in the world, especially given what has been learned in cognitive science, and religions have been saying this for a long time, the world is too big for us to actually be able to fully map and exhaust the map. And I think part of at least what I heard from Jordan Peterson in his introduction to his new book that is coming out bears that in mind. And this is a constant theme with Jonathan Peugeot. And I found this to be a very helpful theme. The world is too big to map, but yet we must live in the world. And systems and structures are really important and helpful for living in the world. Therefore, it only makes sense that part of our approach to the world has to be this humble, intuitive, this is bigger than we know, sort of the spirit of finesse type approach to the world. That's very important and very helpful. And so we need to have that capacity to approach the world. The other hemisphere, the other side, is the spirit of geometry, where those are Pascal's categories, which I think are really helpful and pretty much map onto this, where once we systematize certain things, well, now we can employ them and wield them and use them. McGilchrist's theory is that the systematizer is the servant of the broad, intuitive, open aspect of the brain. Now, how about the church? Well, churches are created to maintain systems. Churches are created to remember and to instruct the youth and to create communities that maintain and perpetuate and also continue to recalibrate what is learned and known. There will be a natural tension in church, this tension that's, and again, Jordan Peterson says chaos. That's the intuitive, implicit perspective from one side of the brain. And order, that's the systemic system of the other side of the brain, okay? Churches have to navigate this dynamic, and churches do so. Now, here's the thing. Let's imagine you've got Ian McGilchrist's idea of the brain, and you add amnesia, a brain that forgets. That's a problem for both sides of the brain, because it's really important to learn and remember systems. In fact, our entire educational system is there to perpetuate knowledge. All right. So think about the fact that the Romans knew how to make concrete. And the formula for making concrete was forgotten for, I might get this wrong, but it was forgotten for 1,000, 1,500 years. What a tremendous loss that was. It's better to not lose these things. And so institutions and communities are set up in order to remember things, to remember what has been learned. But now, also what's genius about a church is that not only are these things remembered, they have to be embodied and lived. And right there you get this line between chaos and order, let's say. Because, well, here's a really important thing. I've been thinking a lot about this Carl Lentz and his affair that he had. It's all over the news. And now that these things, as a pastor, you'll know plenty of incidences of adultery that happen in real life. I can't talk about these things publicly because that wouldn't be right to all the parties. But these people are already in public. They're, in a sense, they've offered themselves publicly by being high status, high profile people. Okay, so here's a nice little system. Don't cheat on your wife. It doesn't go well. Most of us aren't going to debate that. Okay. Now you live in a community, and that community might be his nuclear family, might be his extended family, might be his church. And okay, so he cheated on his wife. What do you do now? Okay, there's going to be a whole lot of spirit of finesse going on in terms of, do you stay together? Do you work on the marriage? Do you fire him? Do the kids just basically hate their dad? Well, part of them hates their dad and because of what he did. But another part of them will never hate their dad because he's their dad. And if they decide they're going to hate their dad for the rest of their life, that's going to destroy them in some really crucial ways. That is, in fact, going to poison their relationships, both romantic relationships and parental relationships that they have in the future. So on one hand, you have a rule: don't cheat on your spouse. On the other hand, you have all of the messiness of life that is way too big to categorize. Now, that doesn't nullify the rule, but the rule is insufficient to actually deal with everything that is going on. So, I was reading an article, and of course, you have to sort of take with a grain of salt everything that the mistress said to Good Morning America, because there's lots of layers on that too. Oh, this was the best sex he ever had. Oh, his marriage is boring. I mean, to what degree is the mistress telling herself this because she's trying to manage the fact that at some point she discovers she's sleeping with a married man? And then she says, well, I never really meant to hurt the wife. And it's like, well, if you really didn't mean to hurt the wife, a good thing would have been to cut off the affair when you learned that he was married. Or even maybe when you suspected that he was married. Or maybe, in fact, if you had gone back to an older mode of human relationships, you might have decided to date him and to get to know him before you went to bed with him. So suddenly all these things are getting exposed by, this one little situation. And there's this one rule. Well, one rule would be, if you're married, don't cheat on your spouse by sleeping with another person. A rule that might have served her would be, how about no premarital sex? If she hadn't had premarital sex with him, How would this sort of story have been different? Oh, well, he met her in the park, and she might have said, "Well, let me get you a cup of coffee," and they might have gone out for coffee and get to know each other, and maybe there'd been some feelings on both sides, but maybe they would have waited. Okay, what does that waiting afford? Well, now the waiting is affording, well, before I actually sleep with you, maybe I should know you. Maybe I should know a few things about your life, like if you're married. Would seem to be kind of an important thing to know. But now we have all these systems, and all of these systems have been displaced and changed and all of that. And so, okay, well, how does McGilchrist's theory deal with the modern church? Well, the modern church or the ancient church is sort of the same. The church, on one hand, tries to remember a bunch of things, and in that sense, gives a nod to the side of the brain that believes in systems and organization. On the other side, because the church is trying to embody this in the messy lives of real people, that means that there's always going to be plenty of messiness. And all right, he committed adultery, so they fired him. Okay, so he's no longer a Christian, and no church should ever have him. Now the church doesn't do that. Well, what are they doing? Well, we're doing therapy. Well, what do they mean therapy? Now we've introduced a whole nother system into this. Okay, but basically what they're trying to do apparently is, let's see if the marriage can be saved. Well, why do you want to save the marriage? And then Daily Mail came out with a picture that his wife had posted on Instagram, and she was happy. And Daily Mail's like, oh no, she's smiling on this picture on Instagram. What does that mean? On and on and on and on. Once you embody something, you begin to expose the limits of the systems. Now, that doesn't mean that the systems are evil or wrong or bad. You just understand that the systems are limited. And so what you have in a mature system, and this is why Jordan Peterson says that ideologies are crippled religions. What do you mean by that? Well, a religion, a full-fledged religion, is far more 360 degrees, because they've been, over time, there's all these systems that have developed, systems within systems within systems, that can begin to address something like adultery and the complexity of humanity. So Carl Lentz talks about, how, he's bored with his marriage. Okay, why is he bored with his marriage? Well, there's probably some good reasons that he's bored with his marriage. If you've ever been married, you know that marriage can be boring, and your spouse can be boring. Okay, so what should you do when your spouse is boring? Well, you should go out and sleep with someone else. Probably not a good idea. Why not? Well, all of these reasons. So maybe you should make your peace with a little bit of boredom in your life and discover that maybe some of the boredom is coming from your spouse. Maybe some of the boredom is coming from you. So maybe you'll talk to someone and someone say, okay, if your marriage is a little boring, maybe there's some ruts you two have gotten into. Maybe you should go and have a date night. Or maybe you should surprise your spouse with something delightful. And maybe your spouse will surprise you with an unexpected response to that. And, so one of the things that my marriage has had its ups and downs, pretty dramatic ups and downs over the years. I've been married 32 years. And, over the last couple of years, actually, COVID has been sort of good for the marriage. Why? Well, we spend a lot of time together, and the kids are home. And, well, kids in marriage are a whole nother dynamic, because on one hand, for most people, the time of least marital happiness is when they are raising young children, which seems crazy, but it's completely reasonable, because young children are incredibly demanding, and you can't do all the kind of fun things that you used to do before the young children came. So again, back and forth between this mapped territory, unmapped territory, back and forth between, here are all these rules. So here's a little rule, do something romantic or delightful for your spouse sometime. That's a good rule. Here's another rule: be kind. Just before we started this, someone noted that my temperament in the morning is quite cheerful. Well, one of the things I had to learn in my marriage is that I am like a golden retriever. I burst out of bed in the morning, and I'm happy, and I embrace the world, and I love it. I want to be loud. And my wife is not that way in the morning. And one of the things I had to learn was, golden retriever has to learn to be quiet in the morning, so that doesn't annoy everybody else in the house. And so, yeah, these are all the things that you learn. So, yeah, there's lots of application for the modern church. But now the second part of your question, in terms of, I have difficulty communicating his ideas to fellow Christians. Well, that's actually a pretty good way of saying it, because probably if you find new ways to communicate it, maybe other people will be interested in it. Churches also have built in within them a resistance to certain new ideas. That's not a bad thing, resistance to new ideas, because new ideas are dangerous. That's in some ways spiritual warfare. And that's why churches are resistant to it. Modern churches are far more open to new ideas than ancient churches. And so what that means is that I think part of what we are all suffering from is the fact that we have been molded and formed and shaped by 18-minute or 42-minute or 2-hour narratives by which a problem arises and it's resolved within 18 minutes or 42 minutes or an hour and 45 minutes or something like that. The real world doesn't work that way. There's a little left brain thing. The real world doesn't work that way. Churches are highly resistant to our influence for very real and important reasons. If the world was simply plastic out there and we could continue to remold it and reshape it according to what we thought in the moment, well, very quickly you'd learn that's not a good thing. I've told this a number of times. Tim Keller, I remember in his earlier 50s, people would say, why aren't you writing books? You're this celebrity pastor in New York City and you've got great ideas and great sermons, yada, yada, yada. And he said, anything I would have written in my 20s, I'd want to burn now. Anything I'd written in my 30s and 40s, I wouldn't be satisfied with now. Now that I'm in my 50s, it's probably a pretty good time to try to write some things. Why? Because, well, the longer you live, if you're paying attention, you should gain wisdom. And what wisdom does is manages both the mapped territory and all of the blessings that can be found in it, but it also learns to manage the unmapped territory and have humility. So you can both integrate the spirit of finesse and the spirit of geometry. And to the degree that you learn these things, maybe you can bless your institutions and your communities with what you learn. And that basically is the human project, how we create culture, how we bless the world and create a better world for each other. But it's, so there's a treatment of it. And like I said, I'm by no means an expert in McGilchrist or even a novice in some ways. I have a basic idea of what his thinking is about, and that's how I'd approach it. Any comments or pushback or feedback on that from anyone who wants to jump into the voice chat channel?
I have some thoughts, Paul.
Go for it.
So, this has kind of been my experience in the church. And I remember the first time I talked to you, I was saying this is kind of like what tends to happen is that, and it's really like a Pageauian fringe periphery center thing, is that when you systematize things, when you set up confessions and creeds and systems and statements of faith, what happens is that you bind and blind, as Haidt, and then what ends up happening is that if you have a conservative church or if you have a liberal church, you automatically systemically exclude the periphery from whatever your confession and your creed is, and then your systems, the very thing that you intended to protect yourself, you automatically exclude the fringe, and it's essentially what's created the culture wars, I would say. And I think that's what McGilchrist is saying. And what's ironic is that within America and within churches, I think within liberal and progressive churches, the spirit is the exact same thing, which is exclusion of the fringe. They just want to normalize the fringe and then exclude the former center, but the pattern is the same.
I think that's true. And that's one of the huge blessings that Pageau has given me in terms of his hierarchy and fringe and center, and understanding that in some ways the fringe is the fringe and the center is the center, and you can try and invert it, but often with a lot of fringy things, if you put them in the center, well, the order breaks down. But usually what happens when order breaks down is new orders emerge. So it's a good observation.
The problem is, though, is that the liberal that started with the conservatives by excluding the fringe initially, and because I don't know, I tweeted like back when I was on Twitter 3 or 4 years ago, the conservative impulse is to exclude and not even acknowledge the fringe, while the liberal impulse then is to want to normalize the fringe, and both are wrong. So like if you and I illustrated that with like my worst church experience in the evangelical church, which was when I no longer believed in eternal conscious torment. I could not become a member of a church, and I personally, in my own experience, experienced what happens more broadly is that people who maybe would be potential for reformation in the church and repentance and a moving back toward what is potentially correcting errors that have manifested in the church and solidified and ossified over time, they're systemically excluded from being able to do that. And there's a spectrum within that. Some of that stuff should be excluded because, it's periphery and it shouldn't be normalized. But sometimes the center is misaligned and isn't the true center. And if you automatically exclude what you perceive to be the fringe, like you've started this whole ball rolling. And so that's always been my big beef with the conservative groups is, I would say, they started it.
Well, Joey isn't in the room right now, but Joey had, a really good insight. He basically made the argument that today's progressives are actually the conservatives of the 1960s. And what I mean by that is today's progressives are trying to conserve the 1960s. You're always going to have this dynamic back and forth. And by its very nature, the center of an organization is going to try to preserve what the organization has been through time. And so time always has this dynamic. And now it's if you wish to change a center of something, you're going to get resistance. It's sort of like, it was sort of like Eric Weinstein complaining about institutions resisting change. And it's like, you don't understand what an institution is. An institution is set up in order to instantiate something beyond individual human consciousness and to give it a manifestation in real time in the world. So to complain that an institution is excluding is sort of like complaining that water is wet. It's the nature of the thing that it wants to instantiate some things and not other things. Now, even by the way that you switched, let's say, the word hell for eternal conscious torment, okay, but is hell eternal conscious torment? That's the question, isn't it, in many ways? And I had never heard of eternal conscious torment, even though I knew all three words. I'd never heard that phrase until maybe a year or two ago. Now, once you forefront eternal conscious torment, you have now, in a sense, modified the understanding of hell. I mean, is hell Gehenna? Is hell Hades? Is hell Inferno, as in Dante? So then when a church let's say, okay, Luke, you can't be a member of this church because you don't embrace hell. Well, you don't embrace eternal conscious torment. So is hell eternal conscious torment? So then you begin to have a conversation. And part of what has been gained in the West was that we were able to create some space between certain ideas. So now in the West, if you go to Geneva and you stand in the street and say, I don't believe in the Trinity, the Genevan City Council is not going to lock you up, and the chief minister of Geneva is not going to burn you at the stake. And most of us would say, that's an improvement. And so now we have all these nested institutions that will say, let's say I don't know what it takes to join the National Rifle Association, even the name National Rifle Association. Why? I'm gonna go to the National Rifle Association. I'm gonna say, I think we need a ban on handguns throughout the United States, and I'm going to start a movement to repeal the amendment of the Constitution that talks about the right to bear arms. And they would probably kick me out of the National Rifle Association because
Well,
they'd say, go ahead, Luke.
Well, this gets into the question, though. I think this is what Tillich was trying to get at when he said all institutions are inherently demonic, though. And this gets into the question of, should the church be the institution? Because what you're essentially saying, and with the whole Weinstein thing, is that institutions, that's what they do, is they exclude things. But if you do that, you're going to exclude the fringe. And if the church excludes the fringe, it's going to ossify around a center. And if that center is wrong, it's going to basically systematize its inability to repent.
In a sense, okay, but in a sense, when you say exclude the fringe, it's really helpful to understand what you mean by that, because exclude, does that mean not allow the fringe into the center, or does exclude mean,
Yeah, agreed.
you know, at what level is exclusion? Because let's say you can't be a deacon or an elder in a particular church because you don't believe in hell, because you define hell as eternal conscious torment. But I dare bet they would let you in the service and let you listen to their sermons, and they would shake hands with you, and they would feed you at a potluck, and they would take care of your children in the nursery, and that hardly seems like a tyrannical form of exclusion.
No, but it's much more passive, but this gets into like what Tyler, I think, articulated really well, is that the church has become a um, a masculine space with feminine language versus a feminine space with masculine language. And so the exclusion isn't masculine, it's feminine. And so it essentially passively mutes you and prevents you, it prevents any dialogue. But like that's what's manifesting in the waste around identitarianism, which I would say came from the church.
Is it really preventing dialogue?
In my
I mean,
experience, it is.
if you would go to church and eat at their potluck and put your kids in the nursery, and they wouldn't let you serve as deacon and elder, and now if you decided you were going to go to church every day with a placard that says eternal conscious torment is evil, they might, yeah, at that point they might exclude you, but they would probably let you hang around, all knowing that you didn't believe in eternal conscious torment. And you know, and again, it would, the manifestation and the embodiment of all of this would be highly nuanced and granular. And that was my point about McGilchrist in terms of the two forms of the brain. So on one side of the brain, you know, the church says, here we have a position of saying hell is real and you are in danger of it if you don't embrace Jesus. Okay. So that's what's on the books. But how do they act it out? They act it out with a whole world of nuance. And they might say, well, you know, Luke, we really like him and he's a good father. And, you know, even though he's not a member of the church, or even though he'll never be a leader in the church, he throws a 20 in the plate sometimes. And we like having him around. And when someone's in trouble, he really helps. So we think he's a good guy. The only thing is he's got this hang up about defining hell as eternal conscious torment. So we're not going to let him in the church. I mean, that's an enormously nuanced approach to you, which is exactly right. But the church has been set up to instantiate and preserve certain bodies of knowledge and information. And you might say, I'm offended that they are trying to preserve certain bodies of information. But if in fact you sat down with the pastor and won the argument and won the whole church to your position, and where little church of someplace, Minnesota, began, you know, putting up signs on the highway and say, eternal conscious torment is a myth. And Luke wins the day and someone comes in and says, you're all going to hell. And you would say, we got to keep this guy out of our church. You know, basically the argument is these dynamics are always going to be there, which is what's at the heart of Peugeot's argument. And you can flip around the name tags and you can flip around the propositions that the groups are holding, but the dynamics are going to lay themselves out in the same way.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, but there's a way. I would argue that there's a underlying spirit that leads disagreement over ideas, which manifests in schism, and one that doesn't. Because like I agree with all the stuff that you're saying.
But the way you just phrased it will manifest in schism because I agree and you don't. Schism
With
is
what?
part of the system. You can't both
Schism is
embrace
part of the
eternal
system?
conscious torment and be against it and have that manifest itself in a community.
So you don't think that it's possible to have a community where there isn't confessionally bound mandated agreement about the three Christian positions on hell?
I don't
Like you
think it's
have to
possible.
choose one.
I don't think it's possible to have a community that doesn't have a confession.
But around the three positions on hell, because like, well, I would argue, like, well, just for example, like Orthodoxy doesn't.
Okay, but that's one position. And so here you have a church that doesn't take a position on that. Let's say we have a community. I don't think I'm not going to say it's not possible to have a community that doesn't take a position on the morality of car ownership. Now, I don't know any church right now that has a stated position on car ownership with the possible exception of the Amish, where if someone in the Amish community buys a car, they're going to be kicked out. The vast majority of churches don't have a position on this. There are going to be positions on various different things, and some communities are going to basically take stands on things and not others. And in fact, part of what happened in the wake of the Reformation around confessionality was that they decided we need to limit the number of things that we are going to take positions on. And that's where confessionality arose after the Reformation by saying, for example, in the Christian Reformed Church, you have the Belgic Confession, the Canons of Dort, and the Heidelberg Catechism. And they said, these are our confessions. You can have freedom about a whole bunch of other things, including car ownership. But now what happens during the 2020 election? Well, some churches, it doesn't seem, they're really struggling with having freedom about what to think about Donald Trump. Because if you love Donald Trump, well, that's not part of our three forms of unity. Another current debate in the Christian Reformed Church is, what do you think about same-sex marriage? Is that part of our three forms of unity? The church is currently working those things out. What I'm saying is there are always going to be elements of both sides of the McGilchrist theory that manifest themselves in churches. Churches are going to bind some things and loose other things, and vice versa. And whether that's revolving around hell is eternal conscious torment or not, that will depend on the particularity of the historical context. But there's always going to be binding and loosing. All right. Anybody want to push back on that or join in on that before I move on? Okay. Wow, this is getting more, and I want people to understand that Luke is a regular here. Anybody who's not a part of this community doesn't know that Luke and I have talked before, and you might say, well, Paul was kind of aggressive. Yeah. Paul usually doesn't get this aggressive. Okay. Well, actually, I only generally get this aggressive if I have an understanding that there's the relational foundation with which to disagree fervently, and I believe that with Luke, and I deeply respect and appreciate and enjoy Luke. So that's why we can go at it like this. And I think this is part of the reason and part of what we're lacking in society, and part of why the internet is difficult, because when two people really go at it over an idea and there isn't that foundation of a relationship, I don't think the interaction is anywhere near as productive or pleasing or enjoyable. So
yeah, Paul, and I always want to say I'm not offended at all. I'm just trying to not dominate the conversation, because I would keep pushing back.
I know you would.
Because this is my one dead horse that I continue to whip, that I think the whole problem in the West is deeper than we're ever getting at. And I think that it's started and was rooted in the church. And Tom Holland says as much. I think it's just he says it positively. I'm trying to say the negative part of it. And I agree, this is what I want to, like, the conversation we're having is what I would love to happen in church. without then people saying, well, I'm going to leave and start my own church. Because we can passionately disagree about things and not have to get divorced, you know?
Yep.
So,
All right, good. Anybody else before I move on?
I have a quick comment. I thought maybe the institutionality sort of misses a piece of this because there's something inherent. I mean, I know you acknowledge this, but there's something inherently dynamic to the fact that Christianity is not just passing on, you know, these are sort of our institutional values and so on. It's passing on this dynamic story and trying to embody the spirit of its founder in its modern context. And so there's sort of that you have sort of Jesus hanging out with tax collectors and sinners, and you have Jesus doing the Sermon on the Mount. So you have both of those dynamics always within the church, pushing it in different directions. And I think that's a healthy dynamic, but I think the big problem with the church today is we're not really having that conversation. We're having ideological culture wars arguments where different tribes want the church to be the engine of their particular culture war, take on the culture war, instead of this kind of healthy liberal conservative dialogue.
Oh, that's really good. That's really good. Dark Rider sounds like a certain welder I know in a certain place in a country north of the United States. So,
Could I possibly ask Father Eric to give his views? Because I think as a Catholic, that might actually be a really good place to hear a very different view.
oh yeah, Father Big Mac, if you're available and you want to chime in, go right ahead. Maybe he's not available. Well, how about you, Jacob?
He's typing. He can't talk.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. So if you're curious about what he thinks, you can read the convo recording chat, which is a function here, part of what we do. And again, for those of you who are listening to the YouTube live stream, I'm not looking at the chat, the live chat in YouTube at all, so I can't answer questions in there. If you want to participate in the conversation, Rick has put in a link to the Bridges of Meaning Discord. I know for some of you, learning another platform is a little bit difficult, and Discord is not terribly intuitive, but that's part of why I do this in Discord, is that we can have people like Luke and others push back and offer new ideas in real time, which I really like. So that's part of why we do this the way we do this on Fridays. Okay. Next question. Is Techne a bridge for meaning? Yes. What does he mean by Techne? Techne is this, it's beneath technology. It's doing things. It's the how-to. It's procedural knowledge. And part of why we are skewed in some ways in these, in a forum like the Discord server, which is better than just a YouTube chat, for example, is we have to put everything into words. Now, words are an amazing tool, and those who can use words well have an amazing power of conjuring up images and pictures and narratives and stories, dramatic, liturgical, imaginary. But there's a reality to three-dimensional, in real life, physical space that cannot be fully realized by mental images or words. And now when we say a bridge of meaning, thinking about, well, bridges of meaning, that's the name of the Discord server. But in some ways, we're downstream from Jordan Peterson's work, and Jordan Peterson uses meaning, or the experiential participation in meaning as a gyroscope for orienting oneself in the world and deciding what to do in the future. Right on my desk right here, I'll show it. I have a lovely gift from Mary Jo. She sent me a little pendant, and she's an artist, and she's been on my channel, and she's in the Discord server, and she made a tiny little estuary there. And see if the camera will focus. Focus, camera, focus. And well, this has weight. This has leather, and well, I'm going to get hung up in my cord, but this is a lovely little instantiation, and the process of making something like this is Techne. If someone would say duplicate what she has made for you, oh boy, I'd have to do a whole bunch of learning. A lot of that learning would be meaningful because, as C.S. Lewis notes, with real things, what I mean by real is all of the layers coming together. Okay, with real things, there's an element to this which is extremely durable. So let's imagine, heaven forbid, that some suicide bomber in some, let's say, I just was watching Jonathan Peugeot and Rationality Rules. I haven't had a chance to finish that video, but let's imagine that some fanatical fan of Rationality Rules decides he needs to silence the pastor of Livingstone's church in Sacramento, and so he's going to fill a Ryder truck with explosives and blow it up in the parking lot, thus snuffing out my life and Rick's life on this Friday morning because he knew we'd be here. Rick's like, hey, why are you involving me in this story? And so Paul Vanderklay at that point would physically be blown apart, and we'd have no more Paul would make no more videos, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This little piece would survive the blast. There's a reality to this. And a lot has been built into this piece. And meaning is swirling around all of this right now. And so, yes, Techne is a bridge to meaning, which is why artists are amazing and valued and should stay with us. So yeah, that's a good question. And anyone want to jump in or make a follow-up point on that? All right, I'll keep going. Laswell. Hi, Paul. Hi, Laswell. I came here following your video response to Peugeot and Sargon because, well, I could pretty much copy and paste his religious trajectory on my own. Harris to Buddhism to Jordan Peterson to Rebel Wisdom to Vervaeke to you. Trying to see if I can get involved in a church community, but it, like many others, seems difficult for me to find a footing. Yeah, and some of those issues might be the kinds of things that Luke was pointing to. There's probably lots and lots and lots of reasons why it's difficult to find a footing. And I have always maintained and will continue to maintain that what we're doing here on Bridges of Meaning Discord server is not church because it is disembodied. But that doesn't mean it doesn't have value. Part of the thing that churches have been doing for a long time is they survive basically by attracting people who sort of already get it. Okay. But there's layers and layers and layers and layers of this. And so part of what I think, and I show myself to be ardently Protestant in this, even though a lot of people are finding themselves most attracted to Orthodoxy or Roman Catholicism in this journey, which I think there's some really important reasons for this. But I show myself to be an ardent Protestant in that I think it's important to continue to create spaces that embody and modulate And so not much of a question. I just wanted to give you feedback on what you're doing. Yeah. So thank you for the feedback. And I'd say, so my friend John Van Donk has started basically a not a support group, but a group for helping people. He's doing it on Zoom, and he's got, I think, 3 groups going now of talking to leaders and potential leaders of small communities that are being created around these spaces and these kinds of ideas. Now, again, I'm not going to call them churches, but what I do know as an experience of a pastor is that lots of different groups provide some overlapping needs that churches have fulfilled. Let me use a historical idea such as AA. AA is a type of group that started addressing alcoholism. They used a lot of different church means and church dynamics, but AA is not a church. I know a number of people, some of whom are pastors, and they'll say AA is better than church. Okay, AA is better than church, often at helping people no longer lose their agency to alcohol. But AA is not better than church and then I can make a whole long list of things that AA is not better in church. But some people will say, but there's an aspect to AA that church should have and should manifest, and it doesn't. A sort of radical inclusion. And, Luke was pointing at some of those things. AA doesn't care if you believe in eternal conscious torment or not. Some people in AA will say alcoholism is eternal conscious torment. What do you mean by eternal? Is eternal forever or is eternal now? So this goes a lot of different ways. And so, Laswell, I would say keep doing what you're doing. You're on a trajectory, and I'm glad you're here in the Bridges of Meaning Discord. And I agree with, when Luke and I, when at it a little bit here, I agree with Luke that part of the reason I started local meetups and have been involved in this community is that there are aspects of this community that I've always wanted to see integrated in church, but have never been manifest in church. I want to have the kinds of, conversations I was having with Luke and with you and with atheists and with people from other religious traditions. And I want to engage in these conversations more. And that hasn't happened in church. And now you get to ask the question, well, what are exactly the boundaries of church? Well, suddenly you have to ask, well, is Bridges of Meaning is not a church. It's certainly not the church, but is it downstream from church? Well, if it's an estuary, it is. So, and some would say, ooh, I saw what you did there, Paul. Well, and I didn't even know I was doing this, but I was acting these things out and I was manifesting these things. So, I was really happy to see the conversation between Jonathan Peugeot and Rationality Rules. We need more of these conversations. And what I've deeply appreciated about what I've seen on this Discord server is that not always, but we've been able to have the dialogos that Vervaeke talks about. We come to this conversation from 2 different points. Might be a point within Christian doctrine, might be a point outside of Christian doctrine. And maybe we both, Luke and I, leave our little interchange. Luke still is, a little annoyed at eternal conscious torment and its positionality within church, and I'm less annoyed. But have plenty of my own nuance along a lot of these lines, or Luke probably wouldn't keep following and participating in this community. But here we're having these conversations, and here we have a space where people can talk and think and work out, and there's enough commonality in language and community that we can actually feel that we are making progress both individually and as a community. That's a really special thing, and I really like that. So, Laswell, it's a great comment, and you are most welcome here. And I'd encourage you to keep being honest and keep asking questions. And yeah, you might not be terribly excited about Luke and his eternal conscious torment, or maybe you are. And I'm glad you're here. And I want to see not only online spaces like this, but also in-person spaces. And now with COVID, it's a little hard. But part of the goal of this has always been, let's build bridges with people different from ourselves and find productive ways to explore the differences and find commonalities and embody those in ways that we can. So anybody else want to jump in on that from the voice chat?
Hey, Paul.
Yeah, Luke.
At the risk of dominating again, which is not really a risk with me, it's kind of a certainty. So this would be a question that I would have with that, is that, because like even the eternal conscious torment thing, to stay on that example, it's just an example. I don't particularly care, I mean, really, that people believe in eternal conscious torment. I don't think they have good reason to, and we can have that conversation if people want to have it. It's more just the binding and blinding, and I want to be able to have the conversation without both me becoming the new cult leader and starting my own group and saying everyone must agree with me, or without the already establishment center saying, no, you can't have that, you can't have the conversation, you are automatically excluded. And that's kind of my whole question, is like, what is the undercurrent, the spirit that manifests the inability to have the conversation without excluding one or the other? Because I would argue that people that are in the center, excuse me, the center can be schismatic as well as the fringe.
Yep. And in the Christian Reformed Church right now, we're having this conversation about same-sex marriage. Many in the center want to change the position of the Christian Reformed Church. And okay, when that's tried to be done from the center, what usually happens is that the organization itself loses an enormous amount of, and we don't even have the word for it, of something. Why? Because every time the center of the Christian Reformed Church tries to make a big change, it loses tens of thousands of people who no longer want to participate in that. So I think that's an issue. But another part of the issue is, I don't think we appreciate how difficult what we're doing is. Let's imagine, so you've got Carl Lentz and his wife sitting with their marriage counselor, and let's say Carl says, I don't want to talk about the affair. I just want to talk about how boring, why I thought our marriage was boring and why I decided to step out and have a 5-month affair with this other woman. And he's probably wants his wife to talk about this stuff theoretically. That's probably the last thing that's going to happen in that room. The wife is like, screw you and your boredom, and you did this to me. That's how we are. We are attached and bundled, and so being able to have the reason a conversation about eternal conscious torment or hell or any of this stuff is difficult is because it is meaningful and it is tied to deep things, most of which we are not even conscious of in ourselves, in the community. I mean, there is, in a sense, I'm going to sound pretty Jungian here, but there is a collective unconscious reality in any community that, by virtue of how we are only marginally aware of, which is why, at least in the history of the particular church that I serve right now, and it happened before I got here, one of the storied fights of the church was when they were going to carpet the stage in front, were they going to make it blue or red? And it nearly divided the church. Now, most of us would say, that sounds completely incidental. But it wasn't. Why wasn't it? Well, you could spend probably a long period of time trying to figure out why it wasn't. But most of us, in the story of Carl Lentz and his wife, could probably completely understand if he wanted to say, well, let's not be too upset about the affair. Let's just try and dive into it and figure out, like, why can't we have that conversation? Well, I think we all have a sense of why they can't just have that conversation as such. We could have that conversation in theory because none of us are tied to the realities deeply beneath it, because we're not interested parties. A therapist would sit in a room and work hours on that, trying to get both of them to that point, because actually it's when he says to his mistress that my marriage is boring, well, there's plenty there to work on, and some of it's hers and some of it's his, but that's the way community is. All right. Anybody else? Okay, let's go on. Adela, darling. Adela, darling. Hi, Paul. I was under the impression that you have read Pistis of Sophia, and I haven't read it since it was brought up before. So I can't comment on it. And thank you for listing it and linking it there. I don't know that I'll read it between now and the next time. So you can ask the question again, but you might get the same answer. All right. Iron Turtle. Is Jesus the manifest unity of aspect God number one and God number two, by virtue of his physical immanence and spiritual transcendence, respectively? I'd say, yeah, I think so. And again, when I talk about God number one and God number two, again, going back to the Ian McGilchrist, we've got this intuitive side of us that is just always playing with stuff really messily. Then we've got this systemic side of us that wants to systematize. And so my God number one and God number two framework is very much in the middle of those things, because I listened to Jordan Peterson describe, what do you mean by God? Sam Harris asks him. Sam Harris, who is annoyed. Well, Sam Harris doesn't even understand why he's annoyed and threatened by Jordan Peterson, but they're on stage and it's fun for us to watch. And so Jordan opens up his Microsoft Surface book and begins reading all of these things. And I remember listening to them. It's like, wow, this is really interesting. And so I transcribed it, actually, because first I got these bootleg transcriptions of those debates and looked at them, and I thought, yeah, that's as even a Protestant with some understanding of our theological tradition, I can recognize that stuff as God. And then Sam Harris just goes off, no, that's not God. Well, what does Sam Harris mean? And so what God number one and God number two became were basically two little cubbies on my theoretical mental workbench. And I throw things in God number one and God number two. And there's immanence and transcendence. That's one of the polarities on there. Another one is sort of the arena and the agent. There's another polarity that I threw in there. I threw all these little polarities in God number one and God number two. And obviously, when you get to Jesus as divine, as fully God and fully man, and all of that Christological conceptualization that the early councils put together. So Jesus would be God number one and God number two, as in fact but Jesus would be I got to really be careful when I start talking about some of this stuff, because I am, I can't in my system, and so I have a fair amount of understanding about Luke's frustration. In my system, I can say the wrong thing here and be brought up on theological charges in the Christian Reformed Church and lose my credential. That is a real possibility. You might say, oh, that's horrible. It really isn't horrible, because actually that's the way the system should work. Now, fortunately, if I would lose my credential in the Christian Reformed Church, they wouldn't establish a stake outside of Grand Rapids to burn me on, fortunately. But anyway, back to the question. Because actually a question arose in my head, spawned by your question, that I'm worried if I ask it, I could get myself into trouble. Because so when you think about, we have Sam in this community, and Sam I usually pick on as Sam Adams, as we call him. I pick him up as our resident heretic, because he is in his description, a biblical Unitarian. He doesn't believe in the Trinity. How is the divine reality manifest in Christ that, at least in a spatio-temporal framework, had not been manifest before? Maybe it was manifest in front of Abraham with the three strangers, but something happens in the incarnation which is critically foundational to the story. And so I'd say, yes, we see God number one and God number two and their unity manifest in Jesus. And that is manifest when he stills the storm. Why? Because the storm stilling miracle is a really clear miracle about agent and arena. And in fact, there's an aspect to our humanity in which we both create the arena, so many arenas we create with these institutions and things, and we're agents within it. And now the agent arena relationship is so much of that Vervaeke stuff, I've learned so much from him, is, super helpful, because it shows a duality. And the dualities are really powerful. And once you see a duality like that, they're like these forks in the road. We can't unsee them. So that adds complexity to our universe. And so what we see in Jesus Christ is, it's just an astounding thing. And we now, thousands of years later of trying to put words around this and conceptualizations and understanding dualities, he's got his human nature and his divine nature, and they meet in him. I mean, it just doesn't seem to end in terms of what it's offering us. So yeah, great question. Anybody want to pick up on that from the chat room?
I'd like to chime in real quick.
Okay.
On kind of what you and Luke were talking about, one of the things I've noticed, because I'm up in the Northwest in Washington State, and there is a lot of freedom up here to talk about things in church. And I was lucky enough to grow up in an evangelical church where my pastor engaged me on many of these topics, mostly in private. But I think one of the reasons a lot of churches don't do this is because of the risk to the weaker sheep. I think those of us who are here in the Discord server, it's because we want to be here having this conversation and we want to think. And I think there are a lot of people in the church, though, and just the world in general, who don't want to think, or who don't want to think deeply about things. So it's very easy for them to be swayed to one opinion or the other. And I think when churches in the past have let people in who have had views that were very different from their own, that's kind of how cults would start and things like that. So I think there's that risk that they're trying to avoid, and I think it becomes a much more delicate balance. So you can't have this kind of discussion at all times in a church. Now, I do think there's a place for it, and I think it would be really good for churches to really go back to an educational classroom function for believers, so that there can be a place where people can go to have these discussions in certain times and places, so that it's there and everybody knows these are kind of like new things that we can talk about, but they're not, what we're going to say is truth in this church or whatever, but I think it's good to have the dialogue, but maybe just in a time and place restricted area.
I think that's a great point.
Yeah, it's just protecting people who are weaker, I think. And I think that's part of what we do. And I think that's a New Testament teaching to us, is that we who are more mature when it comes to like the eating meat sacrificed to idol kind of a thing, is that the stronger can do that, but for the sake of the weaker, let's not do that. And I think a lot of churches maybe take a more authoritative stand on that rather than a more community-based, let's all just respect each other kind of stand.
Yep. No, I think it's a good point. And Paul used stronger and weaker, and I think when we take that in our language, we sort of create a pejorative element to it. But it's, I think about, this will probably get me in trouble, but if I was worried about getting in trouble, I wouldn't be doing any of this. I'll not use that example I was just thinking about. I think I agree with your point completely. And as someone who is responsible for a community, you have to deal with these things because we don't know what ideas are powerful things, and we don't know what ideas will do in a community. And so we're quite an open society. I think in general that openness is healthy, but I can think of a number of ideas that I could speak right now which could devastate this community. Now we think about, you think about magic and spells, and you see Harry Potter and they say these words and they say them in Latin. Well, why do they say them in Latin in Harry Potter? Probably because if you were to say some of them in English, you might actually do damage to a community and to an imaginary. And this is what words do. They are magic in a sense that they are magic, they are spiritual, they change reality. And there's a dozen things that have just popped into my head right now that I could say which would transform my life utterly and completely, and also transform and potentially devastate the lives of people that are around me and some of them that are around you. Now I've just, made you all think, what is that? C.S. Lewis in The Magician's Nephew, I remember as a kid reading this, the deplorable word. And I just kept thinking, well, what is that word? Because, this witch goes into this world and utters the deplorable word and the world is destroyed. Well, that's true. And you think, well, what word would I argue? Now, fortunately, there's a lot of buffers around, but if you look at the current political climate, that is all in many ways about language. What is it that so infuriates so many people about Donald Trump? It's because he doesn't sound presidential. So then, of course, Biden gets in, and Biden he follows the liturgy when he comes in, and a whole bunch of people just sit back and say, oh, we're back to this. Now, and then other people are like, yeah, but what is that going to mean in terms of yada, yada? And there we go. So no, you're exactly right. Great point. Eyes on the truth. Great point. All right. I'll keep going. Mayotic. Mayotic. I don't know how to say a bunch of these things. We've got a head on a stalk here. A brain on a stalk. Paul Vanderklay. I've heard you say that when humans try to bring about utopia, they also bring hell closer. Yes. Could you please explain this thoroughly in respect to God's will and human desire to right injustice? Well, first of all, you note this look around for, I think actually, especially, right now in my mind, having the new announcement of Jordan Peterson's book, Jonathan Peugeot's work that I've been, following quite closely. Peugeot talks about the fringes, and I really want to make a clip of this because it's still ringing around in my head. And if anybody finds it was in a recent question and answer, Jonathan Peugeot did a treatment on basically things that are intentionally hidden and unspoken. And he wove into that an understanding of the good place of that. In our culture, for some good reasons, we have a belief that anything and everything should be brought to the surface right now and be accessible to all. That's a radically egalitarian, democratic, and in some ways naive idea. And what's interesting is that, well, let me use a reference, and Peugeot, I believe, used this reference in the question and answer. Let's say you go into work and, well, let's say you work in a office environment with lots and lots of different people, okay? Well, certain numbers of those people will be physically more attractive sexually than others of those people. So let's say you're a man and you go into the office and you see a woman and she's very attractive and you say, "You look nice today." Or you make other comments about what she's wearing and how what she's wearing accentuates certain features, yada, 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 yada. Let's say you keep doing this. Now, we judge it as progress that you're not supposed to say these things. There's a Saturday Night Live sketch, I think it's Saturday Night Live, with Tom Brady, which is absolutely hysterical. And it makes the point that we all know, whereas if you're Tom Brady and you go into an office and you start verbally, if you start saying wonderful things about how some other woman looks, she's going to find that terribly welcoming. And then some other schlub comes around and says the same thing, and he's in trouble with the HR department. Well, why is that? Well, because there are things that are on the surface, and rightfully so, and things that are below the surface, and rightfully so. And wisdom is about figuring out the time and the place and the when and the where. Now, what happens with utopia is we imagine, and this gets into, I'm going to make a Peugeotian move here right now, because there is a certain, and at some point I'll probably figure this out sufficiently that I can talk about it, and I don't think I'm there yet. Part of what's making Peugeot so helpful right now is a certain move that he makes, which is part and parcel of modernity and post-modernity. I know that's going to disturb some of you, but so what happens if you listen to, again, I'm going to just pick on Sam Harris because he's so well known. That's why I pick on these people, because they're common to all of us. For Sam Harris, the way the kingdom comes is surface, direct, rational, wielded. Okay? So we look around, and for Sam Harris, he thinks that good and evil are obvious, surface, direct, manifest, wielded. So here's the good, here's the bad. So let's just choose the good, and let's employ the kinds of spirit of geometry that we have decided upon are true and bring about these good things. And so an example of that might be, well, there's mosquitoes, and mosquitoes are vectors for all sorts of diseases. So let's decide to get rid of all mosquitoes. So let's get DDT or whatever modern pesticide and spray all the ponds, and let's eradicate mosquitoes. Well, then we discover that we've just been eradicating bees. Well, bees sting too. What's so bad about getting rid of bees? Oh, bees also pollinate. So, well, pollination is and so actually what we've been in the process of for a very long time is saying this is good and this is bad. Let's pursue the good directly, obviously, overtly, and give ourselves the world we've always wanted by eradicating mosquitoes. Then we discover that we didn't just eradicate mosquitoes. We've changed the world in a whole bunch of different ways. And what we often find is that we've eradicated mosquitoes at the cost of bees. And now, in fact, trees and the normal biological reproduction of plants in our world, including the food supply that we have developed over the last 6,000 years in terms of the agricultural revolution, we've just cut our own throats. And so now suddenly, in our pursuit of utopia, which in just a small ways of there being no mosquitoes, now we've brought famine and hunger. And famine and hunger didn't just bring, oh, my tummy feels a little bit bad. Now we've got communities of people robbing. And, well, when they go into rob, I'm coming in here looking for your food, but hey, your daughter looks pretty good. I'm going to take her as well as your food. And I'm going to take her to my house, and I'm going to use her for whatever ends I want her to be used for. So I might employ her as my cleaning lady. I might make her available to my son sexually. I might, and on and on and on and on and on and on and on. And this is a function of the Peugeotian. When you get rid of the when you try to bring, and same Peterson, when you try to bring too much order, you get tyranny. And now, okay, so here we have a system of order, so we want to introduce chaos to it. When you bring in too much chaos, you get disorder. So you have all these polarities. With respect to God's will and human desire to right injustice, the Bible is very clear that, I'm going to use more theological language, the eschaton, which is this age to come, which is and the Bible talks about it in these beautiful terms, when all eyes, when there'll be no more crying, when there'll be no more hunger, when on and on and on, the sum of all of our dreams comes, this will be the work of God. Well, what does that mean? It means that this isn't something we can achieve ourselves. Now, if you look at almost any, and this theological debate is going on in churches right now, and in my own denomination, in my own tradition, is this kingdom something we participate in, something we bear witness to, or something we ourselves deploy? I think the biblical answer to this is always, this is something beyond us. This is because the world is too big. The world is too complex. It might have seemed very straightforward to, bomb the environment and get rid of all these pests, these ants, these mosquitoes. We didn't really appreciate how these things function in the systems that we are reliant upon. So, yeah, that's when you try to bring about utopia, you bring up hell. And Peterson used, in some ways, the Soviet Union was an attempt at that. Well, we know what's good and bad. Oh, do we? Always? In every situation? I mean, let me use a really, was it good or bad for, sorry to use these, I use these people because I think the odds of them actually listening to this are quite small, but maybe in our internet connected reality, not so much. Was it a good thing or a bad thing for Carl Lentz to go and have an affair with this woman? Now most of us would say, well, that's a bad thing. That's easy. And I think 99% probably true. But let's imagine that she got pregnant and a child was born. And then you ask that child, was it a good thing or a bad thing that this man who was married to another woman had sex with your mother and you were conceived and born and brought into the world? I don't know. Maybe, and again, we don't know the future. Maybe, I would find this sad, Carl's marriage would end. Maybe Carl's marriage would end because of this woman. Maybe both of the individuals go on from this marriage and their lives are better because the marriage ended. What do we mean by better? The point here is, we are only human beings. We can't do the math. And there will be good and bad things, the parable of the wheat and the tares. There will be good and bad things in this world, and we can't sort them out. And too much and too aggressive human wielding will bring into our world unintentional consequences. And for all of the thing that bothers me most about so much language I hear on the political right and the political left is we have way too high, we think too much of ourselves. We really think we can know everything, and by our own power, we can bring about the kind of world that we want. And yet, all of that despite the fact that in almost any system, when people do things the right way, many times when they do things the right way, they are blessed by it. But you can find case after case after case of people who did things the right way where outcomes were not as they desired and were in many ways what most of us would say would be bad. But then there'll be a good aspect to it. And life is like that. And so the whole idea about when we try to bring down heaven, we bring up hell. The problem is us. And that's the heart of the story in the Bible. The man and the woman, the Satan looks around and says, the only reason he doesn't want you to eat from that tree is you'll be like him. They're like, I want to be like him. I think being like him would be a good thing. I'd like to manage this world. And the astounding piece of the story that people don't get is that in many ways, even in their moment of disobedience, God gives them exactly what they ask for. You want to run the world? Okay. And, it's the same story in the parable of the prodigal son. You want your chunk of the inheritance? Okay. And God keeps giving this to us. You want to cheat on your wife? Okay. You want to get that job? Okay. You want to do this? Okay. And then we discover, this isn't what we thought. There's the story. All right. Any other comments on that?
I'll go ahead again. First of all, I want to say I think that was really well done, Paul. I totally agree with everything you said there. There is, in my view, I think there's only one way to get to utopia, and unfortunately, it's a catch-22 because the solution is not to force it on anybody, but for all of us to be that person who gets their room in order and takes responsibility and loves others and so on and so forth. And so all we have the power to do is be the steward of ourselves in that. But I think the temptation most people have when they realize this, if we were all just good to each other, then it would be utopia. And so they take that big idea and then they force it on everybody. But once you take the choice away from people, that's when you lose the battle.
Yep. And at the same time, some choices are best not given to people. And we learn that with children. And yeah, it's enormously complex. It's enormously complex. It just really is. And that's why, the book of Job and the Bible's just brimming with wisdom, because Job is, hey, he's been wronged. He has been wronged. He's full of himself. His friends aren't any help. I want God to come down. God says, all right, I'll come down. Tell me how to run the world. And the truth is we think we know how we should run the world, and we just look at each other and see how we're running our own lives. All right. Okay. The Magic Wagon. Hey, Paul. Since I haven't yet encountered the following elsewhere in your videos, I'd like to know if you have a theory on what generally universal life stages exist. This varies some culturally, geographically, and per major life world events, along with other factors. Even so, what stages and trends have you determined to exist in your life that you've observed to likely be present in other lives? For example, if you're familiar with Ruth Vervaake's work, I'm not. You may have stumbled upon her rough outline below, 0 to 20. We're being formed and know it all. I think there's lots of little stages in there too. Like there's lots of little schemas like this. Like from 0 to 6, you keep telling children, you're safe. It's okay. Mom and dad are omnipotent, omniscient, and invincible. And then 7 to 12, you're like, no, there are systems out there. And, you find these, Piaget did these developmental stuff. So there's actually, the problem with this isn't that there are too few schemas, there's so many of them, because there are all these different stages. And there are also, this is where we get into, when we try to study, for a few years ago, so psychology, part of the problem with psychology is it was, okay, this is science. Well, what do we mean by science? We mean that it's like physics. It's like if you go to India or Germany or Argentina, gravity works in the same way. Yeah, there's the context. But if you study psychology in India, Germany, or Argentina, and you run all these different psychological groups, what can you say about a human being? We don't know what a human being is. And part of the problem is we are patterns looking at patterns and looking for patterns. And so this is enormously complex, but these schemas are nice. So 0 to 20, we're being formed and know it all. 21 to 40, life and identity aren't what they seemed. 41 to 60, revise the dream and find our groove. 61 to 80, delight in life, grieve at lost potentiality, pass on the torch. 81 plus, hope to keep our mental and physical faculties. Yeah, that's a good one. I like it. One of the things, just reading it off the top of my head, I think about, so I spend a fair amount of time with individuals who are categorized in our current world as having mental illness. There's so much built into that categorization. It isn't funny. And I think about that a lot because I think we have some understanding what general intelligence is, but I think we have a cultural bias around it. Because I spend a fair amount of time with people with low IQs, and I find a fair amount of wisdom in them because they might not be, and I think about, here's an analogy. So I've followed this this evolution of computers for a while, and the first time I bought a PC, I had to decide whether I wanted to pay a little bit for a 286 or a little bit more for a 386. And some of you will remember those terms. And so then Pentiums came along, and then, dual Intel processors with, dual processors, and then the Core i3, i5, i7, i9 processors. And now we have the Apple Mac 1 processors. And then, I was always buying computers with more RAM and more processing speed, but these spinning hard drives, and then SSDs came along, and it was like, oh, I can have a slower processor, but an SSD, and that architecture will produce some more desirable results than a faster processing or in a spinning hard drive. And now the M1 chip has come along with Apple, and that's making big waves. So all of this stuff going on. So I spend time with people, let's say someone who has Down syndrome. Okay, what capacities, they're clearly limited in certain capacities, but what does living 50 years as someone with Down syndrome produce? There's a lot going on with this stuff. Some people, and part of my bias against a lot of stage thinking, I laughed my head off when I saw Jonathan Peugeot with the Rebel Wisdom Crowd. He got the integral question. It was so funny. That was so funny. But part of me, I don't know if I would have been gentler than Jonathan Peugeot was, but it was hilarious. Part of what always annoys me about these things is that they are setting up hierarchies, and Peugeot of all people shouldn't be too annoyed by a hierarchy. But I think what annoys both Peugeot and I about some of these hierarchies is that they are seen, that they are put too high on a certain set of hierarchies among hierarchies, in that the integral ideas Once you create that hierarchy, you have now, and this is the egalitarian democratic side of me, you have now biased certain things in the system against other things. And almost always what is biased are, and now I'm going to sound terribly postmodern, almost always what is biased are the things that are convenient and convenient for the people setting up the hierarchy. And I see this like in Fowler's developmental ideas about faith, because Fowler's developmental ideas about faith sort of bias someone who, the same people that Ken Wilber's ideas about integral theory bias. They bias people who are high in openness. They bias people who are high in intelligence. They bias people who are fast processors of information. And that they tend to bias people who, with our contemporary democratic, weird Western industrial, educational, on and on, that weird, I can't pull them up all right now. They bias those people. And then when I meet people who, let's say, perhaps are tradespeople, and they work with their hands, and I listen to them talk about their faith, and they have a great amount of respect for the law of the Lord, and they stick to elements of God's law very rigidly. Now, in terms of Fowler's hierarchy of the development of faith, these people would be low. But then when I watch how these people live their lives, you know what I discover often? They're really reliable. They're very honest. They're very loyal. They tithe. They're faithful to their spouses. If the shit hits the fan, I call them. Why? Because their life is put together. And you would look at Fowler's hierarchy of spiritual development, and they would be very low. But I look at them and say, well, they might have an IQ of maybe 100. If you got an IQ of 60, you're really debilitated. But, 90, 100, the difference, between, let's say, 95 and let's say 115, they've got average IQ, but they're really well put together because they have held on to a certain system and they have worked it well, and it has produced wisdom and benefit and stability and really wonderful things for their life. And Fowler's developmental schema of faith completely is unaware of that, because then I look at people who would be high in openness, high in intelligence, sitting atop institutions, religious institutions, churches perhaps, and their marriage is a disaster, and their finances are a wreck, and their kids are a mess. And I look at all these people who were lower on these imagined hierarchies and scales, and I think, I'd rather have their life. I'd rather be less intelligent, a little less open. Part of me wishes I could look at the world in black and white like they do. Now, some smart person might come around and say, but that black and whiteness only works in a system of relative stability where they're holding on to, all of this whole argument that Brett Weinstein has against, trusting the scriptures and the Bible. And I'd say, yeah, there's a point to that, but you're not living any old place. They're living there. And it could be that if chaos hit, they would simply begin their epigenetic treatment of the genetic code of the Bible would shift, and they would start reinterpreting other things. But their basic disposition of rather black and white thinking and of real firm holding on to certain things, that might endure, and that might bless them too. In other words, if we say that the world is so large and so chaotic and too difficult for us to systematize, then certain embracings of certain systems might outperform much more flexible embracings of certain systems. And so that's part of the reason I I think there's a lot of validity to these systems and hierarchies, but they also tend to have also tend to rigidly embrace certain other value hierarchies. In other words, they sort of sneakily do what they are complaining about in their overt system. And that's, in a sense, the entire lie about certain forms of postmodernity, because they say there are no dominating narratives, and by saying it, they just created one. And so that's I like these sort of things, and I think these, but it's all, again, the theme of this video would be the McGilchrist stuff, that these are all left brain instantiations of observations of patterns. And that's really cool. And they're really useful. And they can be really handy. But they are also themselves limited, often by their own thing. So that'd be my take on that. Any comments on that? All right, I'll continue. We're up to November 25, and today is the 27th. We're not even going to get to today. Another 15 minutes or so. So what we usually do for those who are watching on YouTube, again, we're streaming these on YouTube now because I'm lazy, and it's easier just to stream them than to have me do all the other things after. Rick laughs because he knows it's true. And Rick nods because it's true for him too. But so if we do these most Friday mornings at 10 o'clock, and I'm not reading the YouTube comment stream at all. I don't have that in front of me. If I read that in front of me, I would be totally distracted. So I'm just managing what's here in the Discord. And if you'd like to participate live, you can do it from the Discord. And we're going to end this at noon California time, the top of the hour. And then we have unrecorded conversation in this space. And I usually, at that point, sort of take a back seat. I might stay in the room 15 minutes or a half hour or so to answer any follow-up questions. And then I usually go and sit with Rick, and we leave it on in the background and just do other things. So, and what's really been nice about this, and again, the world is too complex to understand how this works, but we kind of get a critical mass in the room here on Friday morning, and at least Friday morning California time, and the conversation just continues to go on throughout the day. And that's been a really cool part of what we discovered by doing this. So, okay. Father Big Mac, Eric. Father Big Mac is a member of this community, and he is, my understanding, he's not yet a Roman Catholic priest, but he's in preparation to become one. And again, this is what's been so cool about this, is that my life is busy, and while there are Roman Catholic priests in this city around me, I never spend any time with them. And so I've been deeply enriched by the wisdom of many in the Roman Catholic Church. And I know that sounds like a betrayal of the iconoclast Protestant anti-Catholicism that unfortunately gripped our tradition for many years. But I love learning from my Roman Catholic brothers and sisters, and so it's been good. So if it is possible to embrace an ancient religion in an overwhelming, is it possible to embrace an ancient religion in an overwhelmingly secular context? Yes. It's sort of the same answer to, can you be a Buddhist in America? That aspects of an ancient religion continue to change. And this is part of the really interesting dynamics of how Jordan Peterson launched the growth of the Orthodox Church in America. I mean, you just think about that. It's just, wow, how could that happen? Well, and you continue to dig into it and you can find it, because we're still processing a lot of the stuff from the Protestant Reformation and the Italian Renaissance and the Scholastic movement and. So yeah, But what's so interesting and terrifying, and I think about this sometimes because Protestants tend to do this rather disingenuous trick of, and I don't mean to be flippant about that, but on my shelf, I can pull off a book that was written in the 1960s by the Christian Reformed Church. And when I read that book, it's like, here's the New Testament, here's the Protestant Reformation, here's 1960 in the Christian Reformed Church in North America. It's just boom, boom, boom. It's all one of a kind. If I could go back and converse with Jacob's nemesis, the Apostle Paul, there would probably be things in my life that the Apostle Paul would be horrified at. And there'd be things in the Apostle Paul's life that I would be horrified at. Partly because we're separated by all of this time. At the same time, there would be things that we could find unity around. And so a Roman Catholic believer in 2020 is going to be, it would be very interesting if you could take that believer and in a 300-degree way compare that person to someone in 1390 in France. There'd be a tremendous difference. So, is it possible? Sure. What is it going to look like? Those are really interesting questions. How can one tell the difference between possessing a religious worldview and possessing a secular, oh gosh, this is a good question, and possessing a secular religion with a religious accessory overlaid on the surface? Oh, yeah. And that's where Tom Holland's book was so helpful for me. Once I began to understand his thesis, it's like, oh, so much of what, because why, gosh, this, so much of how this has developed has, for me, has been, I look at people in the church and I look at people outside the church. And in a tradition that has a fair amount of antithesis like my own, people in the church are supposed to be really different from people outside the church because of the preaching of the word, because of the means of grace, because of, and in some ways, people in the church are, and in some ways they are not. And so that's why I say those of us who believe in God are way more secular than we would care to admit. And what Tom Holland does is sort of flip the script and say, all of you people who are atheists out there, you believe in God way more than you act as if, I mean, Jordan Peterson had the guts to say it, and he could say it because he wasn't within a religious tradition. And so that's sort of where Jordan Peterson and Tom Holland come together, because what they do is that they recognize that a lot of these really important instrumental categories that we use in our world today to organize are both enormously valid and have limitations on their validity. And so there is, as a Dutch Reformed person, there is a ton of the Western church inside of me. And part of the reason that when a married woman winds up dead, the first suspect is her husband. Well, those dynamics between Protestants and Catholics, because we're so close to one another that, the potential for explosive conflict is great. I used to notice this in the Dominican Republic when I was there, that Puerto Ricans could minister to Haitians, but Dominicans had a hard time ministering to Haitians because Dominicans and Haitians were too close. Puerto Ricans had a hard time ministering to Dominicans because they were too close. So Dominicans and Puerto Ricans are quite close, but they're divided by the fact that all Puerto Ricans have American passports and Dominicans don't. And the history of the Dominican Republic and the history of Puerto Rico in many ways was quite close. They're both Caribbean islands, had Spanish, were Spanish colonial territories, yada, 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 but they're far enough away that, so the issue of close and far, and that's the same thing with secularity. And I think Tom Holland's observations that he brought to us about how close secularity is to religiosity, and we're discovering this now. I can't tell who's got the noisy mic in the room. I muted one of you already. Okay. So in India, I caught an article. In India, the government is, I don't know if they're censoring. There's a show on Netflix in India where a Hindu and Buddhist, basically, there's a lot of tension between. I snicker every time people are like, oh, those Abrahamic religions, the world would be much less violent if we didn't have these Abrahamic religions. Well, I guess you don't read news coming out of India very often, do you, about the kind of tensions that they have between Buddhists and Hindus? So there's a show on Netflix which has, I don't know if it's a marriage, I'm gonna have to dig this one up, between a Buddhist and a Hindu, and it's a happy marriage, and the government of India would like to suppress this. Why? Well, because this is what we do. These are how these things lay out. And what secularity afforded, and again, Tom Holland has example after example about this, basically how British colonial power suppressed the Islamic slave trade and forced Islamic countries to outlaw slavery. Okay, is that a good or a bad thing? Is colonialism good or bad? Is Christianity good or bad? Come on, people. We're smarter than this. We can do this kind of math. So, yeah, secularity is a product of Christianity. Oh, and so ironically, when someone who is Orthodox or Roman Catholic embraces what is an Enlightenment idea of religious tolerance within a state government, they're being Protestant. And I'm not saying that to put it in anybody's face. I'm saying it to just recognize that we have these categories, and I have to recognize them too. There are some real tensions. Yeah, okay, let's use this example. Should adultery be illegal? Tolerance for adultery? Why do we have it? We're increasingly intolerant with respect to opinions about same-sex marriage or behavior, but we're tolerant about adultery. Why? Those are hard questions to answer. Should we be? That's a far harder question. Just like getting rid of mosquitoes. Should we get rid of mosquitoes? I'll tell you, if you're laying in bed and you hear that buzzing around you, and you think about the Zika virus or malaria or dengue fever or any of those things, you say, yeah, let's get rid of mosquitoes. All right. Is it worth getting rid of mosquitoes if we also get rid of bees? Well, no. Oh, okay. Well, what if we actually got rid of mosquitoes only to discover that mosquitoes are fulfilling a function in our ecosystem that we had zero understanding of, and now we've gotten rid of mosquitoes and we're going to have to try to bring them back. So yeah, the world is big and complex, and so I'm this person that's very high in openness and certainly not as smart as the Weinstein brothers or Jordan Peterson, but maybe my IQ is, I don't even know my IQ and I don't care to know it. Maybe my IQ is a little above average, let's say. That's what I would guess it would be, a little above average. I'm all those things. And so certain kinds of religious and non-religious people like to listen to me. But there are other religious people who see much more in black and white, and they listen to my videos and say, Paul Vanderklay is part of the problem. Because Paul Vanderklay is watering down the black and white. And I would have to listen to them and say, they probably have a point. But Then they might turn around and say, that's because you're high in openness, aren't you? You're so high in openness, you don't even have a problem with antithetical people. Yeah, that's probably right. But I also see their value, and I'm glad they're in the ecosystem. And even as a high in openness person, I should have a stronger appreciation for the antithetical. And my life would probably be better served if I had a few harder and richer and more legalistic and ideological rules than I do. So life is like that. All right. That's a good way to close this out. Rick says good. So I'll just give a little thank you for listening. Thank you for joining on the YouTube live stream. Thank you for coming into the Bridges of Meaning Discord server and participating in this and asking questions. Sorry I didn't get to all your questions, but we'll probably pick them up next week if Lord willing. See, there's one of my I like saying Lord willing. The Bible says say Lord willing. And why does the Bible say Lord willing before we say we're going to go and do something? Because I don't know if it'll happen. I could have a heart attack this week. That Rationality Rules fan with the truck full of fertilizer and explosives could detonate in the parking lot, and Rick and I would be gone. Rick's like, why do you keep taking me with you on these on these Rationality Rules terrorist plots? But here we are. So thank you for listening, and Rick's going to end the transmission, and I'm going to run off to the bathroom because I've been sipping tea this whole time. That's probably more than you wanted to know. But and then we'll have some chat in the Discord server. So thanks for coming. All right, Rick.